Marcus Thompson stood in the fluorescent-lit checkout line of the corner store, his weathered hands clutching a single pack of diapers and his last crumpled $5 bill. Behind him, a woman in an expensive coat watched quietly as he counted coins with trembling fingers, unaware that she was Catherine Wells, CEO of Wells Industries, worth $300 million. What Marcus didn't know was that Catherine had been wandering the city's poorest neighborhoods for months, searching for something money couldn't buy: authentic human connection. And what Catherine couldn't have predicted was that this struggling father's simple act of love for his child would shatter the walls around her heart and change both their lives forever, in ways neither could imagine. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The first rays of dawn crept through the threadbare curtains of the tiny one-bedroom apartment, casting gentle shadows across the worn linoleum floor where Marcus Thompson had already been awake for an hour, watching his 2-year-old daughter Emma sleep peacefully in her makeshift crib fashioned from a dresser drawer lined with soft blankets. Her tiny chest rose and fell with the rhythm of innocence, her dark curls catching the morning light like spun silk, and Marcus felt that familiar ache in his chest, the overwhelming love mixed with crushing worry that had become his constant companion since Sarah's death. He moved with practiced silence through their cramped living space, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he opened the kitchen cabinet to find exactly what he expected: one box of generic cereal with barely enough left for Emma's breakfast, a can of formula that would last maybe 2 more bottles, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 28 years old, and he felt ancient, every line on his face earned through sleepless nights and impossible choices between paying rent and buying groceries. He poured the remaining cereal into Emma's favorite bowl, the one with faded cartoon characters that Sarah had bought at a garage sale when they still believed their future held promise, and carefully measured the portions, knowing this would have to last until he could find work, any work. The photo of Sarah on the makeshift nightstand seemed to watch him with those warm brown eyes he'd fallen in love with, her smile frozen in happier times when they dreamed of giving Emma everything she deserved. Marcus opened his worn leather wallet, counting the crumpled bills and loose change with methodical precision. $5.47. Enough for diapers or formula, but not both, and Emma was down to her last 2 diapers. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore, asking not for miracles but for strength, for the chance to be the father Emma needed, for the dignity to keep going when everything inside him wanted to crumble. As Marcus gently lifted Emma from her makeshift crib, her sleepy eyes fluttering open to find his face, the memories crashed over him like they did every morning, transporting him back to that sterile hospital room 2 years ago, where Sarah had labored for 18 hours before the complications began, her hand gripping his as the monitors screamed their warnings and the doctors rushed around them with controlled panic in their voices. He'd held their newborn daughter for the first time while watching his wife slip away from internal bleeding that no amount of medical intervention could stop. Sarah's last words a whispered plea for him to give Emma all the love she wouldn't be there to provide. And in that moment, Marcus had made a promise that he'd kept every single day since, even as the medical bills began arriving like vultures, $57,000 that devoured their small savings and forced him to take out loans against their tiny apartment. Emma gurgled happily as he changed her diaper, one of only 2 remaining, and he remembered how his construction foreman had been understanding at first when Emma caught pneumonia at 6 months old. Then patience wore thin when she developed chronic ear infections that meant sleepless nights in emergency rooms and missed days on job sites where reliability meant everything. The pink slip had come on a Thursday, delivered with genuine regret but firm finality. They couldn't hold his position when he'd missed 3 weeks in 2 months, and Marcus had cleaned out his locker knowing that his daughter's health would always come before any paycheck. Since then, he'd survived on odd jobs that paid cash under the table, cleaning office buildings at night, while Emma slept in her carrier, loading trucks at dawn before she woke up, painting houses on weekends when Mrs. Paradis Rodriguez from downstairs could watch her, but nothing steady, nothing that could climb them out of the hole that kept getting deeper with each passing month. He dressed Emma in her favorite yellow dress, the one Sarah had bought before she was born. And as his daughter clapped her tiny hands and babbled Dada with pure adoration, Marcus felt that familiar surge of fierce determination that had carried him through the darkest moments. Because Emma would never know hunger if he had to skip meals himself, would never feel unloved, even if they lived in this cramped apartment forever, would never doubt her worth even though the world seemed determined to measure theirs in dollars they didn't have. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant coffee. As Marcus walked the 6 blocks to Mrs. Rodriguez's small apartment, Emma perched on his hip like a tiny queen surveying her kingdom, her chubby fingers tangled in his worn jacket collar, while she pointed excitedly at passing dogs and chirping birds with the wonder that only a 2-year-old could possess. Mrs. Rodriguez had been their guardian angel since Sarah died, an elderly woman whose own children had moved away, but whose heart remained large enough to embrace a struggling father and his daughter, refusing Marcus's attempts to pay her the little money he had because she saw something precious in their bond that reminded her of her late husband's devotion to family. She opened her apartment door before they could knock, her weathered face breaking into the warm smile reserved especially for Emma, who immediately reached out her arms with delighted squeals of Abuela Rosa in the mixture of English and Spanish that Mrs. Rodriguez had been teaching her. Marcus set Emma down gently, watching as she toddled toward the basket of toys that Mrs. Rodriguez kept specifically for her visits, and he knelt down to Emma's eye level, his heart clenching as it did every time he had to leave her, even briefly. "Daddy has to go to work today, sweetheart," he whispered, smoothing her dark curls with infinite tenderness. "But I promise when I come back, I'll have everything you need, diapers and milk and maybe even those animal crackers you love so much." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of his words, then threw her small arms around his neck in a hug that nearly broke his resolve to be strong, her innocent trust in his promises both his greatest motivation and his heaviest burden. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed his shoulder as he stood, whispering in accented English that she would keep Emma safe and happy, that he should focus on his interview and not worry about anything else. And as Marcus walked away, he could hear Emma's laughter floating through the thin walls, a sound that fueled his determination like sunlight feeds a growing plant. Standing at the bus stop with his carefully pressed shirt and his father's old tie, Marcus closed his eyes and sent up a desperate prayer to whatever force in the universe might be listening, asking not for wealth or luxury, but simply for the chance to provide for his daughter with dignity. For this job interview to be the turning point that would let him give Emma the stable life she deserved. The warehouse manager, a stocky man named Bill Henderson with calloused hands and kind eyes, had seemed genuinely impressed as Marcus described his construction experience and his willingness to work any shift, any hours, his desperation carefully masked behind professional courtesy and the confident handshake his father had taught him years ago when the world still held promise. Henderson nodded approvingly at Marcus's work ethic, his punctuality record from his previous job, his eagerness to prove himself, and for a brief, shining moment Marcus allowed himself to imagine Emma's face when he told her they would finally have steady income, that he could buy her new clothes and toys, and maybe even find them a better apartment with a real bedroom for her. But then Henderson's expression shifted when he asked the inevitable question about emergency childcare, his pen hovering over the application as Marcus explained with quiet honesty that he was a single father with no family nearby, that sometimes his daughter got sick and needed him, that he would move heaven and earth to find coverage, but couldn't guarantee he'd never miss a day. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on Marcus's chest as Henderson's face softened with what looked like genuine regret. The older man explaining that they needed someone who could commit to the schedule without exceptions, that they'd had problems before with unreliable employees. And though he seemed to genuinely want to help, the bottom line was the bottom line. Marcus shook Henderson's hand with the same dignity he'd entered with, thanking him for his time and consideration. But inside he felt something precious crumble as another door closed on their future, another opportunity slipping through his fingers like sand. Walking afterward through the city's financial district where glass towers stretched toward heaven and men in $1,000 suits hurried past with phones pressed to their ears, Marcus felt the crushing weight of contrast between their worlds, watching through restaurant windows as businesspeople enjoyed lunch that cost more than he spent on groceries in a month. The sidewalks here were pristine, the buildings gleaming monuments to success he would never touch. And every passing stranger seemed to radiate the confidence that comes with security, with knowing their children would never want for anything, with never having to choose between diapers and dinner. And Marcus pulled his thin jacket tighter against the autumn wind, wondering if Emma would forgive him for failing her again. 50 stories above the bustling streets, where Marcus Thompson walked in quiet desperation, Catherine Wells stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, her manicured fingers pressed against the cold glass as she gazed down at the ant-like figures scurrying through their lives far below, each one carrying dreams and burdens she would never know or understand. Despite commanding a business empire worth $300 million, the mahogany desk behind her held the trappings of unprecedented success contracts worth millions awaiting her signature. Invitations to galas where she would smile emptily while writing checks that could change lives, and in the center of it all, a silver-framed photograph of an 8-year-old boy with her same green eyes and an impish grin that had been silenced forever on a rain-slicked highway 5 years ago, when a drunk driver stole her entire reason, living in a moment that replayed in her mind every single day. Michael had been everything pure and good in her world. The only person who saw past her wealth to the mother who would have traded every dollar for one more bedtime story, one more scraped knee to bandage, one more chance to hear him say, "I love you, Mommy," in that sweet voice that haunted her dreams and made waking up feel like punishment. The accident had shattered more than just her family. It had destroyed her marriage to David, who blamed her for working late that night instead of picking Michael up from soccer practice herself. And though the drunk driver bore the legal responsibility, Catherine carried the crushing weight of guilt that maybe if she had been there, if she had chosen her son over another board meeting, if she had been the mother Michael deserved instead of the CEO the world demanded. Her assistant Jennifer knocked softly and entered with updates about the Wells Foundation's latest initiatives, funding for homeless shelters, scholarships for underprivileged children, donations to hospitals that would bear her name on gleaming plaques. But Catherine barely listened, because she knew the truth that no one dared speak. All her charitable giving was just money thrown at problems from a safe distance. Clinical transactions that helped her sleep at night while keeping her heart safely locked away from the messy reality of human suffering. She had never held a homeless child's hand, never sat with a grieving parent, never allowed herself to truly see the faces behind the statistics, because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of losing someone again. And Catherine Wells had learned that some wounds never heal. They just teach you to build walls so high that even your own humanity cannot climb over them. For the past 6 months, Catherine had developed a ritual that her driver and security team knew nothing about, slipping out of her building through the service elevator in clothes she had purchased specifically for these expeditions, a worn gray coat from a thrift store, faded jeans that cost less than what she typically spent on coffee, and scuffed sneakers that made no sound as she walked through neighborhoods where her real identity would have created walls of deference and calculated kindness that she had grown to despise. She wandered these streets like a ghost seeking redemption, observing families gathered on stoops, sharing meals that cost less than her lunch but seemed infinitely more nourishing, watching children play with improvised toys while their parents worked multiple jobs just to survive, witnessing a kind of authentic love and community that her wealth had somehow insulated her from completely. Every interaction in her regular life felt choreographed. Now people told her what they thought she wanted to hear, smiled when they needed her money, performed friendship and concern with the practiced ease of those who understood that Catherine Wells, the CEO, required careful handling, and she longed desperately for just one conversation where someone saw her as simply human rather than a walking bank account. But even in these poor neighborhoods where she thought she might find the genuine connection her soul craved, Catherine remained trapped behind invisible barriers of her own making, too afraid to truly engage because what if they discovered who she was? What if even here her money corrupted everything it touched? What if the authentic moments she observed from a distance evaporated the moment she tried to participate? Today, something pulled her toward the corner store, 6 blocks from the financial district. The same direction where Marcus Thompson walked with his last $5.47, though neither knew of the other's existence yet, and Catherine adjusted her thrift store coat against the autumn chill while battling the familiar war between her desperate need for real human connection and her paralyzing fear that Catherine Wells was too damaged, too isolated by wealth and grief, to ever truly belong anywhere again. She had built an empire but lost her humanity somewhere along the way. And these walks through authentic poverty felt like a kind of penance, a search for the person she used to be before money became both her power and her prison. The rhythmic sound of her sneakers against cracked pavement became a meditation as Catherine walked deeper into the neighborhood, each step carrying her further from the gleaming towers of success and closer to memories of Michael that felt both precious and devastating, because the truth she had never spoken aloud was that she had barely known her own son despite loving him more than life itself. 8 years old when he died, and how many of those years had she spent in boardrooms instead of playgrounds, in conference calls instead of bedtime stories, building an empire while missing the small moments that she now realized were the only ones that truly mattered in the cosmic ledger of a human life. She remembered his last school play, where he had been a tree in the forest scene, standing perfectly still with his arms stretched wide like branches. And she had arrived 20 minutes late because of a merger meeting, slipping into the back row just in time to see him take his bow, his eyes scanning the crowd hopefully until he spotted her, and his whole face lit up with joy that she had made it at all. That smile haunted her now because it represented everything she had taken for granted: his unconditional love, his willingness to forgive her absences, his simple desire for her presence that she had treated like another item to be scheduled between more important obligations. Michael had collected rocks. She remembered suddenly, ordinary stones that he would polish and arrange on his bedroom windowsill, telling her elaborate stories about where each one came from and what adventures they had experienced. And she had smiled absently while checking emails on her phone, never truly listening to the mythology of his childhood imagination. She had donated $12 million to children's hospitals since his death, funding entire wings and purchasing equipment that would save countless young lives. But she had never held another child's hand, never allowed herself to connect with the very people her money was meant to help, because the risk of caring again felt too dangerous for a heart that had already shattered beyond repair. Something indefinable pulled her toward the small corner store ahead, a gravitational force she could not explain, as if the universe was gently guiding her toward a moment that would change everything, though Catherine had no way of knowing that inside that unremarkable building, a struggling father was about to teach her the difference between charity and compassion. The bell above the corner store door chimed softly as Marcus stepped inside, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across shelves, stocked with necessities priced just beyond the reach of people like him. And he moved with quiet determination toward the baby aisle, where packages of diapers sat like precious commodities behind their bright plastic wrapping. His weathered fingers clutched the $5.47 that represented everything he had left in the world, and he approached the display with the careful reverence of a man who understood that every cent mattered when you were counting the difference between your child's comfort and your own hunger. The price tag on the smallest package of diapers seemed to mock him with its bold red numbers, $6.99. And Marcus felt his heart sink as he performed the desperate mathematics that had become second nature, calculating and recalculating as if the numbers might somehow change through sheer force of will. Behind him, the door chimed again as Catherine entered wearing her thrift store disguise, her trained eye immediately cataloging the stark differences between this neighborhood market and the upscale shops where she usually conducted her business. But something about the man in front of her captured her attention with an intensity that surprised her. She positioned herself one aisle over, pretending to examine canned goods while watching Marcus through the gaps between products, and what she witnessed made her breath catch in her throat because she recognized the body language of desperation. The way he stood perfectly still for long moments, as if frozen by impossible choices, the slight tremor in his hands as he picked up the diaper package and read the price again, as though it might have changed. Catherine had seen this same calculation performed by executives weighing million-dollar investments, but this man was weighing something far more precious. his daughter's immediate needs against their next meal, and she realized she was witnessing the kind of moral mathematics that her wealth had protected her from ever having to understand. Marcus set the diapers back on the shelf and picked up a loaf of bread instead, then put it back and reached for the diapers again, his internal struggle playing out in slow motion while Catherine watched from the shadows, recognizing in his quiet dignity something she had been searching for without knowing it. Something authentic and pure that existed in the space where love meets sacrifice. Marcus finally made his choice and approached the counter with the package of diapers clutched in his weathered hands, his face a mask of carefully controlled composure as he placed them before the teenage clerk who looked no older than 17, with bored eyes and fingers that moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had processed thousands of similar transactions without ever considering the human stories behind them. The boy scanned the barcode with practiced indifference, announcing $6.99 in a monotone voice, while Marcus carefully laid out his crumpled $5 bill and began counting the remaining coins with methodical precision, his fingers trembling slightly as he arranged quarters, dimes, and nickels on the scarred counter surface. Catherine moved closer, pretending to browse the magazine rack, while her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched this intimate moment of human vulnerability unfold, seeing how Marcus counted the coins 3 times as if hoping the mathematics might somehow shift in his favor, his shoulders sagging infinitesimally when the total remained stubbornly short of what he needed. "I'm 52 cents short," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that small amounts could represent insurmountable obstacles when you had nothing left to give, and he looked up at the teenager with eyes that held no anger or entitlement, only the desperate hope of a father who had run out of options. "I can pay you the difference tomorrow morning when I get to work," he continued with careful dignity. "I live just 6 blocks from here, and I promise you'll have your money. But my little girl needs these diapers tonight." The teenager, clearly uncomfortable with a situation his employee training had never covered, shifted nervously and mumbled something about store policy and how he couldn't make exceptions, his words trailing off as he seemed to recognize the profound need in Marcus's face, but felt powerless to help within the rigid constraints of his minimum wage authority. Marcus nodded with quiet acceptance, gathering up his coins with hands that shook just enough for Catherine to notice, and in that moment she witnessed something that her billions of dollars had never purchased: the grace to maintain dignity in the face of humiliation, the strength to accept rejection without bitterness, the kind of character that her wealth had insulated her from experiencing firsthand. He counted the coins once more, as if performing a ritual of hope, and Catherine felt something crack open inside her chest as she realized she was watching a masterclass in human resilience, seeing how love for a child could transform poverty into nobility. In that crystalline moment when Marcus began to turn away from the counter with empty hands and quiet defeat, Catherine felt something ignite in her chest that had been dormant for 5 years, a maternal instinct that transcended the careful walls she had built around her heart, and without conscious thought, she stepped forward while fumbling deliberately with the clasp of her expensive leather purse until it tumbled from her fingers and struck the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the small store like a gunshot. Bills scattered across the dirty floor in an explosion of green and brown 20s, 50s, even a few hundreds that she had forgotten were tucked inside, and quarters rolled in every direction like escaping prisoners, while Catherine stood there with perfectly feigned shock and embarrassment. Her acting skills, honed by years of corporate boardrooms, where showing weakness meant death. Marcus immediately dropped to his knees without hesitation, abandoning his own problems to help a stranger collect her scattered money, his weathered hands moving with careful precision as he gathered bills and coins, while Catherine knelt beside him, close enough to see the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes and smell the faint scent of baby powder that clung to his jacket. She watched in amazement as he handed her every single bill and coin he collected, his fingers never lingering on the money, despite the desperate need that had brought him to this store, never palming even a single dollar that could have solved his immediate problem. And when she pressed a 20 into his hand, saying it was a reward for his honesty, he gently but firmly pressed it back into her palm with a quiet, "Thank you, but I can't accept that," that nearly brought tears to her eyes. Catherine stood there holding her retrieved purse while Marcus walked away with the same empty hands he had arrived with, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had just witnessed something extinct in her world, a man whose integrity remained intact despite facing impossible circumstances, whose character could not be purchased or compromised, even when his child's needs hung in the balance. And she realized that after months of searching these streets for authentic human connection, it had finally found her instead. Catherine caught up with Marcus just outside the store, her heart pounding with an urgency she hadn't felt in years, as she called out, "Excuse me, sir," and watched him turn with the patient expression of someone accustomed to disappointment, but still capable of courtesy towards strangers. "Please let me buy you a cup of coffee," she said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. "I know it sounds strange, but what you just did in there, your honesty, when you could have easily taken some of that money, it means more to me than you could possibly understand. And I'd like to thank you properly." Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what felt like charity, but something in her voice must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly and followed her to a small diner 3 blocks away where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the coffee came in thick ceramic mugs that had seen better decades. Sitting across from each other in a cracked vinyl booth, Catherine watched as Marcus wrapped his hands around his mug for warmth and began to speak about Emma with a tenderness that made her chest ache, describing how his 2-year-old daughter had her mother's laugh and a stubborn streak that kept him on his toes, how she loved to sing made-up songs and insisted on wearing her yellow dress even when it needed washing, how he would do anything to give her the life she deserved even though he was failing at every turn. When Catherine gently asked about Emma's mother, Marcus's voice grew soft with grief as he explained how Sarah had died in childbirth, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone while drowning in medical debt and struggling to find steady work that would accommodate his daughter's needs. Catherine found herself sharing carefully selected pieces of her own story, telling him about losing someone very precious to her, about the way grief could hollow you out until you forgot how to connect with other people, about the regret that comes from realizing too late what truly matters in life. And she watched Marcus nod with the understanding that only comes from walking through similar valleys of sorrow. Their conversation flowed with the easy intimacy of two souls, recognizing kindred damage, and Catherine marveled at how Marcus never once complained about his circumstances or expressed bitterness toward a world that seemed determined to keep him down. Instead, speaking only of his love for Emma and his determination to be the father she needed, displaying a grace under crushing pressure that humbled her more than any boardroom victory ever had. As their conversation deepened over refills of bitter diner coffee, Catherine listened with growing amazement as Marcus quietly revealed the full scope of his struggles without a trace of self-pity, explaining how the $57,000 in medical bills from Sarah's complicated delivery and subsequent complications had consumed their small savings and forced him to take out loans against their apartment, how he had lost his construction job, not due to poor performance, but because Emma's frequent illnesses meant he couldn't maintain the perfect attendance record that blue-collar work demanded in an unforgiving economy. She watched his face as he described the endless cycle of job interviews that went well until potential employers learned about his single father status and the possibility that he might need time off for sick child, emergencies, how he had been surviving on cash-only odd jobs that paid just enough to keep their tiny apartment and put food on the table but never enough to climb out of the debt that grew larger each month with interest and late fees that seemed designed to trap people exactly like him. What struck Catherine most profoundly was how Marcus spoke exclusively about his love for Emma and his determination to give her a stable, happy childhood despite their circumstances, never once asking Catherine for help or even hinting that he expected anything from this chance encounter beyond the simple human connection of shared conversation. He talked about reading Emma bedtime stories borrowed from the library, about how she had learned to count by helping him sort their loose change, about the way she would pat his face and say, "It's okay, Daddy," when she sensed his worry, and Catherine realized she was witnessing a kind of parental devotion that her wealth had never been able to purchase or understand. Her mind began racing with possibilities. She could offer him a job at one of her companies, pay off his medical debt with a single check, set up a trust fund for Emma's future, but every idea felt wrong somehow, like it would rob Marcus of the dignity that defined him and transform their genuine connection into another transaction where her money solved problems from a safe distance. She found herself wrestling with a dilemma she had never faced before. How do you help someone when your very ability to help comes from a world so different from theirs that any assistance might feel like condescension? And how do you honor someone's strength while acknowledging their need, especially when that someone has never asked for anything except the chance to provide for his child through his own hard work? After they parted ways outside the diner with promises to perhaps meet again someday, Catherine found herself walking several blocks behind Marcus as he made his way through the neighborhood, her heart pounding with the strange thrill of stepping outside every boundary she had constructed around her carefully controlled life, though she told herself she was simply curious about this man whose quiet dignity had touched something dormant in her soul. She watched from across the street as Marcus climbed the steps to a modest apartment building and knocked on a door that opened to reveal an elderly Hispanic woman, whose face immediately broke into warm recognition. But it was the small figure that burst past the woman and launched herself into Marcus's arms that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat with a sharp pain that felt like remembering how to feel. Emma was a whirlwind of dark curls and sunshine yellow dress, her tiny arms wrapping around her father's neck with the complete trust and unrestrained joy that only exists between a child and the parent who represents their entire safe world. And Catherine watched through tears she hadn't expected, as Marcus lifted his daughter and spun her around while she giggled with pure delight, their reunion so full of mutual adoration that it made Catherine remember every school play she had missed, every bedtime story she had delegated to nannies, every moment with Michael that she had sacrificed on the altar of building an empire that felt meaningless now, in comparison to this simple display of perfect love. Over the next 3 days, Catherine used her considerable resources to discreetly investigate Marcus Thompson, learning from his former construction supervisor that he had been one of the most reliable and skilled workers they had ever employed. Hearing from neighbors who spoke of his quiet helpfulness and unwavering honesty, discovering that even in his current desperate circumstances, he had never failed to pay Mrs. Rodriguez the small amount he insisted on giving her for watching Emma, despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. Every piece of information confirmed what Catherine's instincts had already told her, that Marcus Thompson was exactly the kind of man the world needed more of, someone whose character remained unshakable even when everything else in his life had crumbled. And she began to formulate a plan that would require all of her business acumen to execute properly, because she understood that helping someone like Marcus would be the most delicate negotiation of her career, requiring her to find a way to change his life without destroying the very qualities that made him worthy of help in the first place. 3 days after his encounter with the mysterious woman at the diner, Marcus woke to the sound of Emma's labored breathing, her small chest rising and falling with frightening effort as fever burned through her tiny body like wildfire. And he knew with the terrible instinct of a parent who had already lost too much that this was no ordinary childhood illness, but something far more dangerous. Her temperature had spiked to 104 degrees, despite the children's acetaminophen he had carefully measured from their nearly empty bottle, and when she began coughing with a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in her lungs, Marcus wrapped her in her favorite blanket and ran through the pre-dawn streets toward Metropolitan General Hospital, with Emma burning like a coal against his chest. The triage nurse at the private hospital took one look at Emma's obvious distress and began the intake process. But when Marcus admitted he had no insurance and could provide no proof of ability to pay for treatment, the administrator's expression shifted from professional concern to bureaucratic coldness as she explained that they could only provide emergency stabilization before transferring them to the county hospital across town. Marcus felt his world tilt off its axis as he realized his daughter's life was being reduced to a question of financial liability, that in the most critical moment of her young existence, she was being treated not as a desperately ill child, but as an unprofitable problem to be shuffled elsewhere. And he gathered Emma closer to his chest and ran back into the night toward the overcrowded public hospital, where the waiting room was packed with other desperate families whose poverty had relegated them to second-class medical care. 4 hours passed in a fluorescent-lit purgatory where Emma's breathing grew more shallow. While they waited behind dozens of other patients, her fever refusing to break despite every cooling method Marcus could think of. And when they were finally seen by an overworked resident who confirmed pneumonia and explained that Emma needed immediate hospitalization, Marcus learned that even here his lack of insurance meant delays, paperwork, and the constant threat that his daughter might not receive the level of care she needed. Sitting in that plastic chair with Emma limp in his arms, Marcus faced every parent's ultimate nightmare: the helpless terror of watching your child suffer while being powerless to provide the one thing that might save her. And he pressed his face against Emma's burning forehead and whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep, telling her that Daddy would fix everything, even as his heart shattered with the knowledge that love alone might not be enough. In the sterile hospital hallway that smelled of disinfectant and desperation, Marcus finally reached his breaking point, sliding down the wall until he sat crumpled on the cold linoleum floor, with his phone pressed against his ear as he called every number in his contact list, with the frantic energy of a drowning man grasping for anything that might keep him afloat. Mrs. Rodriguez answered immediately, but could only offer prayers and the few dollars she kept in her coffee tin for emergencies. His former construction supervisor expressed genuine sympathy, but explained that the crew had no emergency fund for former employees, and his brother in Denver listened with growing helplessness before admitting that his own family was barely making ends meet and he had nothing to send. Each conversation ended the same way, with kind words and empty promises that felt like small deaths, as Marcus realized that despite all the people who cared about him and Emma, none of them possessed the financial power to bridge the gap between his daughter's desperate need and the medical establishment's cold calculus of payment and care. Through the glass doors of the pediatric ward, he could see Emma lying so still in her hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines that made her look impossibly small and fragile. And the sight of her suffering while he sat powerless in the hallway made him want to scream with a rage that had no target except the cruel mathematics of a system that measured a child's worth in dollars he would never possess. In his desperation, Marcus pulled out his wallet and stared at the one valuable thing he still owned, Sarah's simple gold wedding band that he had kept on a chain around his neck since her death, planning to give it to Emma when she was old enough to understand its significance. And he calculated frantically whether a pawnshop might give him enough to at least make a down payment on Emma's treatment, though he knew even selling his most precious possession would barely scratch the surface of what the hospital would demand. Meanwhile, across the city in her penthouse office, Catherine received a carefully worded report from the private investigator she had hired to keep tabs on Marcus Thompson's situation. And when she read the words, "Daughter hospitalized with pneumonia and unable to afford treatment," she felt something crack open in her chest that had been frozen since Michael's death, a maternal fury that made her hands shake as she grabbed her coat and keys, finally understanding that all her months of searching for authentic human connection had led her to this moment where she could choose to be either a spectator to tragedy or an instrument of salvation. The monitors in Emma's room began beeping with increasing urgency as her oxygen levels dropped and her breathing became so labored that each breath looked like a monumental effort for her tiny body, and Marcus pressed himself against her bedside rail, while Dr. Martinez, the attending pediatrician, delivered the words that felt like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. Emma's pneumonia had developed into acute respiratory distress syndrome, her small lungs filling with fluid faster than the current treatment could address, and she needed immediate transfer to Children's Mercy Hospital, where they had specialized equipment and pediatric intensive care specialists who could provide the level of intervention that might save her life. Marcus listened with growing horror as Dr. Martinez explained the transfer process with the careful neutrality of someone who had delivered similar news too many times before. And when Marcus asked the inevitable question about cost, the doctor's pause told him everything he needed to know before the words confirmed his worst fears. Children's Mercy would require a substantial deposit before accepting the transfer. And without insurance, that deposit would be more money than Marcus could earn in 5 years of steady employment. Sitting beside Emma's bed as she fought for each breath, Marcus felt himself drowning in a helplessness so complete that it made him question everything he had believed about being a good father. Because what kind of parent couldn't provide basic medical care for their child? What kind of man allowed his daughter to suffer because he lacked the financial resources that other fathers took for granted? He held Emma's burning hand while tears streamed down his face and whispered desperate apologies for failing her, for not being able to give her the life Sarah would have wanted, for bringing her into a world where a child's survival depended on her parents' bank account rather than their love. The machines continued their relentless beeping while Emma's condition deteriorated with each passing hour. And Marcus realized he was watching his daughter slip away not because medicine couldn't save her, but because he couldn't afford the medicine that could. And in that moment of absolute despair, he understood that love, no matter how fierce and pure, was not enough when the system demanded payment in currency he would never possess, leaving him to face the unthinkable possibility that his failure as a provider might cost Emma the only thing that truly mattered. Marcus looked up through his tears to see the woman from the diner standing in the doorway of Emma's hospital room. But something was different about her appearance. Gone was the thrift store coat and worn jeans, replaced by clothes that whispered of wealth and authority. And when she spoke, her voice carried a gravity that made him suddenly understand this was not the chance encounter he had believed it to be. "My name is Catherine Wells," she said quietly, stepping into the room with careful deliberation. "And I want to pay for Emma's transfer to Children's Mercy Hospital. For all her medical care, for everything she needs to get well, but I need you to listen to me before you say no." Marcus felt his face flush with humiliation and anger as the pieces fell into place. The mysterious woman who had seemed so interested in his story was Catherine Wells, the billionaire CEO whose name appeared on buildings across the city, and their coffee together had been nothing more than charity disguised as friendship. "I don't need your pity," he said through gritted teeth. His pride wounded more deeply than his circumstances, because he realized she had been studying him like a specimen, evaluating his worthiness for her beneficence, and he started to turn away until Catherine's next words stopped him cold. "I had a son named Michael, who died 5 years ago when he was 8 years old," she said, her voice breaking with a pain that sounded as fresh as his own. "And I spent his entire life building a business empire instead of building memories with him, missing soccer games for board meetings, choosing conference calls over bedtime stories. And now I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but I would trade every penny for one more day to hold his hand." Marcus saw tears streaming down her face as she continued, explaining how she had been searching for months for something authentic and real, how their conversation in the diner had been the first genuine human connection she had felt since Michael's death, how helping Emma wouldn't be charity, but a chance for her own broken heart to begin healing by honoring the kind of father Michael deserved but never had. "Please, don't let your pride cost Emma her life," Catherine whispered, moving closer to the bed where Emma lay, struggling for each breath. "Because saving her might be the only way I can save the part of myself that died with my son. And maybe together we can make sure that love doesn't fail when it matters most." Within hours of Catherine's intervention, Emma was transferred to Children's Mercy Hospital in a state-of-the-art ambulance equipped with pediatric specialists who monitored her every breath during the journey across town. And Marcus found himself walking through corridors lined with original artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the halls with natural light instead of the harsh fluorescent glare of the county hospital. Emma was immediately admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit, where a team of doctors led by Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the country's leading experts in childhood respiratory diseases, began an aggressive treatment protocol that included cutting-edge medications and therapies that Marcus had never even heard of. And for the first time since Emma had fallen ill, he felt hope beginning to bloom in his chest as he watched the monitors show steady improvement in her oxygen levels and breathing patterns. During the long days and nights that followed, Catherine became a constant presence at the hospital, not as the wealthy benefactor swooping in to save the day, but as someone who understood the terror of watching a child fight for life, sitting beside Marcus in the family lounge and sharing stories about Michael while they waited for updates from the medical team. As Emma's condition stabilized and she began to show signs of her usual spirited personality, demanding her yellow dress and asking for animal crackers, Catherine approached Marcus with a proposition that she had been carefully crafting during their hours together. She explained that her foundation donated millions to worthy causes, but lacked the authentic connection to the communities they served, that she needed someone who understood both struggle and dignity to help her ensure their money actually reached the people who needed it most. and she offered Marcus a position as community liaison that would pay a salary substantial enough to provide Emma with security while allowing him to use his own experiences to guide the foundation's work. "This isn't charity, Marcus," Catherine said firmly, as they watched Emma color in a hospital bed that no longer frightened her. "This is me offering you a job because you have something I desperately need: the ability to see past statistics to the human faces behind poverty, to understand what dignity looks like when everything else has been stripped away, and to help me become the kind of person who truly helps, rather than just writing checks from a distance." 6 months later, Marcus Thompson walked through the gleaming offices of the Wells Foundation with the confidence of a man who had found his purpose, his weathered hands now carrying folders filled with stories of families whose lives were being transformed not just by money, but by programs designed with genuine understanding of what poverty actually looked like from the inside. His days were spent visiting the neighborhoods he knew intimately, sitting in cramped apartments and community centers where he listened to single mothers and struggling fathers share their dreams and fears, then returning to translate their needs into actionable initiatives that Catherine could fund with the precision of a surgeon rather than the broad strokes of traditional charity. Emma had blossomed in their new apartment, still modest by Catherine's standards, but a palace compared to their previous one-bedroom existence, and she had developed a special bond with the woman she called Aunt Catherine, who visited every Wednesday evening for dinner and weekend mornings for trips to the zoo or children's museum. Catherine marveled at how Emma had filled a void she hadn't even realized existed. This bright-eyed little girl who showed her the world through the lens of wonder and possibility, who climbed into her lap during story time and asked endless questions about everything from why flowers grew to whether angels had favorite colors. Their friendship had evolved into something neither had expected. Not the relationship between benefactor and recipient, but between two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their fractured hearts. Marcus discovering that wealth didn't automatically corrupt when it was wielded with wisdom and humility, Catherine learning that her money became meaningful only when filtered through genuine human connection and guided by someone who understood both dignity and need. The foundation's impact had grown exponentially under Marcus's influence, their programs now reaching people who had previously been invisible to traditional charitable organizations, and Catherine found herself sleeping peacefully for the first time since Michael's death, her dreams filled not with regret and emptiness, but with Emma's laughter and the satisfaction of knowing that her wealth was finally serving a purpose worthy of the love she had failed to give her own son, healing her wounded heart, one authentic human connection at a time. On a crisp autumn afternoon that painted the world in shades of gold and amber, Catherine Wells pushed Emma Thompson on the bright red swing at Riverside Park, her heart swelling with a kind of joy she had forgotten existed as the 3-year-old's delighted squeals filled the air like music that could heal any wound. Marcus sat on a nearby bench watching this scene that had become as natural as breathing over the past 6 months, marveling at how seamlessly Catherine had woven herself into the fabric of their small family, not as the wealthy benefactor who had saved Emma's life, but as Aunt Catherine who knew exactly how Emma liked her pancakes cut into star shapes and could recite every word of her favorite bedtime story about the brave little rabbit. Their modest 2-bedroom house 3 miles from the foundation offices had become a sanctuary where authentic relationships flourished far from the calculating world of corporate boardrooms and charity galas, where Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator and Catherine's reading glasses lived permanently on the kitchen table beside coloring books and alphabet flashcards. Sunday morning breakfasts had evolved into sacred rituals where Catherine would arrive with fresh bagels and Emma would climb into her lap to share dreams from the night before, their bond deepening with each shared laugh and whispered secret. And Marcus would watch these moments with profound gratitude for the woman who had taught him that kindness could exist without condescension, that generosity could preserve dignity rather than destroy it. Catherine had found in Emma the daughter-shaped hole that Michael's death had carved in her soul, while Emma had gained not just a benefactor but a grandmother figure who understood that love measured in time spent was infinitely more valuable than love measured in dollars given. And as Marcus watched Catherine spin Emma around until they both collapsed in giggling heaps on the soft grass, he realized that their story had never really been about money saving the day but about 3 broken hearts finding the courage to heal together. The playground around them buzzed with the sounds of other families creating their own memories, But in this perfect moment, Marcus understood that he and Catherine had both found what they had been searching for in their different ways. The authentic human connection that transcends every barrier society builds between rich and poor. The love that sees past circumstances to the soul beneath, and the profound truth that sometimes salvation comes not through grand gestures, but through the simple decision to let another person matter enough to change your life forever.